So our first speaker is Peter Jones. He's been working on Lustre since 2006, and he's the co-lead of the Lustre Working Group, a director of the Administrative Council of EOFS, and runs the Web Cloud Engineering Division at DDN.
Hi everyone, how does that sound? Hear me okay? Okay, very good. So just like to echo Gail's comments, just really good to be back here in person. And thanks so much for the CA team for putting on this event. I definitely agree, it's very much appreciated in the Lustre community, all the work they do to make this possible. So I'm going to give you a bit of an update about the Lustre community releases. And the Lustre Working Group is an organization which, as many of you may know, focuses on activities relating to the Lustre community releases. So myself and Dustin Leatherman from Oak Ridge, the co-leads of that group, but it's open to anyone to participate. The mailing lists here on your left, the URL on your left gives the links, which has all the details about the calls and the minutes of the meetings and the mailing list. So you could, even if you can't make the call, you can still follow along with what's being discussed and maybe ask questions via email or what have you. One of the activities we get involved in is compiling the questions for the annual Lustre survey. So you may well have seen a request to sort of complete that sort of every sort of February, March of the last sort of 10 years or so. You can see here, this graph shows the number of respondents we've had over that period. So it fluctuates a little bit. We generally get a fairly healthy number of people completing the survey, and we definitely do, that does help inform some of our decision making, the results we get from that. So we try and balance it so it's only going to take a few minutes to complete to try and encourage people to participate. So it isn't a great time investment, and it really is useful for us if you do take that time. So I did go into a bit more detail about this year's survey in my presentation I gave at LUG earlier this year, which perhaps more of you would have seen than usual because it was, a virtual conference. And the URL here on the right has all the historic results if you wanted to go and sort of do some wading through that. I'm just going to comment on a couple of specifics from that survey today, which I think are particularly relevant. So this is the Lustre version survey. So at the time that the survey went out, the 2.15 release wasn't out yet. So at that time, we see the similar pattern that we've seen over the years, that older versions, people, over the years, this is the last 3 years data together, you see stepping down as people upgrade or take older systems out of service, and strong coalescing around the sort of the LTS releases. So that's sort of 2.10 and 2.12 here. But the thing that was quite surprising was we saw strong adoption of 2.14 to the extent it actually overtook the 2.10 release this year in terms of the number of sites who had at least one production usage on that version. And since then, we've had the 2.15 release come out, and there was a question in the survey about how quickly people intended to move to that release once it was out, as we were anticipating it being soon. So the blue section on this pie chart is the people who indicated they planned to immediately upgrade to the 2.15 release once it was available. So 28% is a fairly significant proportion. I mean, historically, going back over the years, people were definitely fairly cautious about doing a major version upgrade, but clearly there's, as we saw from the adoption of 2.14, people, whether it's for features or newer kernel support on the servers or a combination of those, there's definitely some people who are very attracted to the move to something more current. Whereas, obviously the green and the red could be characterized as, wait and see type options. And so people are sort of interested to see what the early adopter experiences are like before making a firm decision about their own plans. We also, to summarize, I would expect to see in the 2023 survey strong adoption of 2.15, not to the extent of 2.12 still, but certainly probably that will be the second most common option I expect. And then we did ask a couple of qualitative questions of people to supply, thoughts about feedback. So when we're sort of trawling through those, sort of really looking for comments where there's multiple people saying largely the same thing, and so we asked a question about the workings of the Lustre Working Group, and really most people just skipped that question, and the people who did complete it sort of maybe the feedback was not really actionable. So I really took that as perhaps most of the respondents weren't really that familiar with what's going on to really give an informed opinion. But much more people did complete about Lustre to provide some kind of opinion, as you would expect. So we did get a number of people making comments about stability without really sort of elaborating as to any particular areas of concern there. So I sort of took that as more of a indication that we have a mature feature set, and so there's no sort of glaring gaps that people are looking for, and they really would like to have more engineering focus on sort of doing what we're doing, covering different sort of edge cases and things, and really improving, which I think is broadly what we are doing. There was also a number of comments about from people who use Lustre on ZFS, saying that they wish that the LTS branch would move to a more current version of ZFS. So this is really perhaps just a sort of lack of awareness, or us not doing a good enough job in promoting that awareness, because we had with the 2.12 releases been including patches to allow people to be able to use newer ZFS versions, but we just hadn't moved the default version forward because there hadn't been strong enough feedback that people were using those newer versions stably in production. And so we always sort of err on the side of caution with the LTS releases in terms of what we backport, so that people can feel comfortable to move to those newer releases and don't suddenly get some unexpected, unwelcome surprise when they do so. We did have a couple of comments about people saying they wish there was some easier way to add and remove storage with Lustre, and which is, I think, fair comment, and is definitely something which is in our minds for possible future work. And there were a number of various comments about that I'd characterize as either about specific kernel patches or support for people's favorite Linux distribution. And so with all those, I would say that basically we're kind of you have a lot of flexibility what you can use with Lustre. You're not limited to do where we focus our own testing centrally on, and many people are in production using other options. If we get sort of feedback that we should alter our focus, we definitely will. That's kind of one of the things where the survey is very useful. So going on to the specifics about the releases, so 2.12 is now sort of been around a while, very widely used, quite sort of mature, so the rate of changes there and releases has really dropped off. So we had the 2.12.9 release come out in June, which provided support for RHEL 8.6 clients, and so we're in the transition period now where we would, potentially could do releases for both 2.12 and 2.15. So it's pretty likely we'll have a 2.12.10 come out at some point. The most likely trigger being RHEL 8.7 clients. Of course, the exact timing of the Red Hat 8.7 releases, perhaps a bit uncertain, but it wouldn't be terribly surprising if there's one out by the end of the year that we then provide a 2.12.10 to cover support for. Similarly, we've had a 2.15.1 release come out last month, and with that we provided, again, support for RHEL 8.6 clients, and this slide's a little incorrect, that it's actually Ubuntu 22.04 clients was in that release. This is a slightly down rev slide. I made a couple of last minute tweaks. Unfortunately, didn't get those through. But with 2.15.2 2, we do have, we will be adding support for Red Hat 9 clients and SLES 15 SP4. We were initially hoping to have those in 2.15.1, but there was a little more work required, and we didn't want to delay the release for everyone for those. So that work has now merged. So if anyone's interested in experimenting or running testing, the tip of the B215 branch does have those changes that would allow you to build and run. Wouldn't recommend it for production until we have a fully qualified release, but certainly, if you're looking for some, to get an early read and perhaps provide some feedback, that's definitely an option. So 2.15, so the 2.15.0 release went GA in June, and we had a pretty lengthy release cycle for this release. I think because there was awareness that it was going to be an LTS release, we had strong engagement from the community with testing on release candidates, and we did have some issues raised that we sort of, dug into and held the release until we had resolved. Some of those issues transpired to be very sort of edge cases that potentially could have been hit on shipping releases that were already out but hadn't been, including very old releases. But as a result of that extra activity, the positive outcome is that we have the .0 release would be higher quality as a result. On the slight downside, it did mean as we go into code freeze, our policy is not to change the Linux distributions we're testing when we're in code freeze. Usually that period's only a matter of weeks, a few weeks. But as timing worked out, it was slightly extended. And during that period, I think every distribution we supported did issue a release. So when we had the initial release come out, it did look slightly out of date. We did then immediately resolve at least the most, some of that with the 2.15.1 release fairly shortly afterwards. Going on to the contribution statistics. So I did show some provisional data like this in my LUG presentation, but this is the final data from Dustin. So the graph on your left is code reviews, and the graph on your right is lines of code changed across different organizations. So this being a European event, I will sort of particularly spotlight the contributions from European organizations. So we have GSI from Germany, SUSE, and our host CEA, all participating in reviews. And on the actual code contribution side, again, SUSE, a very significant number of changes involved, and also we have Atos and Sanger in the UK also had some changes in there. So this is showing how the 2.15 release compares to sort of earlier releases over time. So I've shown this data in a tabular form previously, but I think putting it into a graphical form does make it easier to sort of see differences over time. So the graph on your left is about code change. So the upper blue line is the lines of code changed, and the lower red line is the number of commits in each given release. So you see there's fairly reasonable correlation between those two. And then if you look at the last point on the graph, the far right, you can see that 2.15 in terms of lines of code changed is relatively high compared to its predecessors. But I think that's more of a factor of the lengthy release cycle rather than, actual very significant changes having occurred. And then the graph on the right is contributions by developers and organizations. So the blue line is the developers, and the red line is the organizations that those developers work for. So you'll see again the overall trend there, I think, going right back to 1.8 is of a gradual increase, and there's sort of some fluctuation. And most people, even on a tabular form, people would often ask questions about the big spike on 2.9. and it really jumps out with, when you show it graphically. So you'll see there's no equivalent sort of spike on the lower organization line. And so what we had at 2.9 was essentially one particular organization flushed the cache, as it were, and we had a large number of, a backlog of some years of changes come up, which were largely very small, 1 or 2 line changes to test and such like that. That did sort of rather inflate the overall number for that. But broadly, if you ignore that anomaly, you just see a very gradual increase with some slight variation. So all this talk about contribution has probably got you all fired up. How can I contribute? So we've been talking about the development side of it, and we do have, there is information on the wiki about the logistics of that, and you can talk to myself or Sebastian or Andreas, who, if you don't know who those are, they'll be presenting later today, the other two, and so you could talk to us about the logistics of that. But I appreciate that's not going to be for everyone, but most people who use Lustre will have some interaction with the documentation. So if you're finding things in the documentation that could be improved, gaps, whatever, please let us know. There's a huge body, the manual's huge. There's also a great deal of material on the wiki site. And so, it's very easy for some things, we know if there's something new that needs to be put in, but it's very often, possible for things to gradually become, slightly stale or over time. And so, or have, some gaps that, people who are reading it new, it's easy for them to spot and to flag. So, if you're finding it difficult or not useful, and you flag that, that can help us fix that and make it easier for, people in the future not to run into the same challenges. Then sort of being involved in events, community events like this, even just attending is useful. It's really great to be able to network and chat directly with people who are using the software. Further than that, I do encourage people to consider giving talks for these kind of events. I think site updates, often when, chatting to people and you ask them that, and they say, oh, no one would be interested in what happens at our site, but then you talk to them and you're like, well, yes, they would. So I think it's just very, very valuable to have that kind of exchange and even giving a short 15-minute presentation about the Lustre usage of your site, I think can be, other people in the community would appreciate that. Completing the survey, I've already plugged that, but again, I will mention it. The Lustre Working Group, again, the URL again of where you can get information about that. And then if your organization is not a member of one of the community groups, consider it's not a huge cost, but it really helps collectively for us to have these community organizations having the funds to keep active and to keep promoting Lustre out in the community. So again, I'm involved with both organizations, and if you're interested in what the mechanics are there, I'll be happy to chat with you about that. Moving on to 2.16, we're expecting that for the first part of next year, and there's Andreas, and we'll be talking a bit more about the development going on. We do sort of typically for the roadmap, which is here, we tend to pull out sort of some of the bigger ticket items that we anticipate are going to be in a given release time frame to sort of promote that, but there's generally a lot of very interesting sort of next stage evolution for stuff that's already there that Andreas will go into a lot more detail about in his talk. And then just to see, on the roadmap here, we do show what the planning, switching over between the LTS release as well as the broad timing of the releases. As you can see, we're going to, as we're in a more mature sort of feature set sort of stage with Lustre, we're not sort of churning out the major releases every 6 months. We're more like sort of a year apart type timing now. And then I was thinking with the, it came up as I was putting this presentation together that there was somebody posted on the mailing list with one of those like, this is a common misunderstanding people have. And it struck me that I should use this opportunity to sort of just create some better awareness about these things that do seem to perennially come up, and just in case that there's anyone else out there who unaware of these things. So one is that you should always use the latest E2FS progs if you're going to be running a file system check or something. You're not tied to the version that's shipped with at the time of your Lustre version coming out. Another one that seems to come up fairly often is people grab the largest tagged version that they can find, and that is often a development build, not a build that's been fully qualified and expected to be used for production. So if you're running 2.15.53, that is not better than 2.15.1. So anything over 50 is a development build, and you should be looking, expecting your number to be 10 or less for the final digit, and then you're in an official release. And then the other thing that comes up often is we find people are running, they're reporting some known fixed issue, and when you say, well, you're running 2.12.3 and that's fixed in more current 2.12 releases, they say, well, I can't move to that release because I have to use this specific kernel version. So even though we test with the latest kernel version at the time of a given release, that doesn't mean that you can't build the same Lustre code against a slightly down rev kernel version if you wish. And many people do that, and that seems to work fine. It could be a bit trickier if you went to a newer version than what had been tested. There could sometimes be something that breaks the build or some unexpected behavior. But typically, once we have a certain version that has been working at some point, it will continue to work. We don't, it shouldn't. Certainly with maintenance releases, you would expect that to be consistent. So it's always better to have the latest Lustre code, even if you're running a slightly older kernel version. So just to summarize, so 2.15.2 should be out by the end of the year, 2.16, sort of maybe Q2 next year, and the Lustre working group details are there. So that's me right now. Any questions either here, or are we able to take questions from the people watching on YouTube?
Maybe.
Maybe, okay. Well, anyway, for the people here in the
No
room...
question for now, online.
Sorry?
No question online.
No questions online, okay.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, and for people actually here, I'm happy to chat on breaks or, lunch or whatever as well, if people would rather ask questions then.
First of all, thanks to Peter.
Okay.
Any questions?
Hello.
Hi, Gwen.
Hi. Will you ever be supporting Ubuntu servers?
I think that falls in the category of if there's sufficient demand, we could do. But it's basically, with the server versions, in the past as well, we've had questions about SUSE servers. And so, generally there's a patch set there that builds and works. And James Simmons will be happy to chat to you about the joys of Ubuntu servers. But in terms of what we're focusing our testing on, we're really focusing on Red Hat and Red Hat derivatives because that's overwhelmingly what our customer base are interested in. So it's a bit chicken and egg there, I suppose. I don't really, I'm agnostic to it, but I only want to test one. It doubles the test matrix, right, if we do some other option.
James, would you like to add something?
Yes, I do regular testing and stuff. And actually at the last slug, we gave a presentation about setting up a test system, just like what LambCloud does for external distributions, like Leonardo does it for their ARM. And if anyone in the community wants to actually tackle that, the Jean-Lin from ARM and I can talk to you about our experiences trying to set up a test system for external testing.
Right. I think the tricky thing would be is that Ubuntu can jump forward quite aggressively with kernel versions, and I think you would feel the pain of that a lot more rapidly on the server side. So whoever's signing up for that needs to be in it for the long haul, right? So anyway, was Thomas, did you have a question?
It's actually an online question from Nicolas Chauvet. You have mentioned testing Red Hat release ahead of general availability, such as 8.7. Do you find CentOS Stream useful for this matter?
We haven't used that. We do qualify as a Red Hat partner, and so we tend to use like beta versions from Red Hat ahead of the release. Not every release has one, but we've done that certainly with like Red Hat 9. We had some access to that ahead of time.
Hi. I see on the email list some talk about the ARM versions.
Yeah.
Could you say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been questions about having better, ARM support for years, and I will say the most recent effort from the engineers working on it presently has been great. They've really got engaged, and they've done some, fixed up some long-term, there's all kinds of things just on the tests, there's all kinds of assumptions in the tests, based on assuming it's x86, that means that tests always fail on ARM and things like that. They've gone through and fixed up a lot of that, they've got got their own test system running, which will, we have in our testing already to do ARM clients. We've had that for some years, but they're also testing ARM servers as well. So yeah, it's definitely improved, and we've recently added a link. They've got some download from what they're testing when we have the releases, so you can click and download from there as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? No.
There's another online question from George, who asks, can we safely assume that if it works on Red Hat, it will work with Alma or Rocky Linux?
Yes. I mean, in my experience entirely, I mean, we do actually test with Alma as well as Red Hat. We test, I was mentioning Red Hat specifically because that's where the original ones with the betas you would have, and then we do test with Alma as well, and we do have customers who are running Rocky, and we've not found any differences to date.
So one thing I noticed, if you go back to your slide about the graph, the time graph contributions versus lines of code, you were saying that there's actually more commits. You had the graphs backwards. So in fact, the number of lines of change in 2.15 is basically static. It's just that there's more commits because of smaller patches. Right. So the blue line is the number of commits, which has grown up quite a bit. But in fact, the red line is the lines of code, which is relatively static.
I have them correct. I just described it wrongly.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Thank you,
Okay.
Peter.
Thank you.